Osiris is one of the central gods of ancient Egypt, a ruler of the dead, a figure of kingship, and a symbol of renewal. To understand why his name endured, it helps to begin with the oldest surviving Egyptian funerary texts, where he appears tied to burial, judgment, and the hope of continued life. The story was never fixed in one form. Different periods and texts vary in how they describe his death, restoration, and role beyond the grave, but the pattern remained powerful. Osiris mattered because he linked royal authority with the fate of every dead person who hoped, like the king, to live again. Long before Osiris became the god most closely linked with the Egyptian dead, Egyptian religion already contained many local powers. Different regions honored different deities, and those gods could overlap in function without ever becoming one uniform system. Some were tied to the floodplain and the growth of crops. Some were linked to kingship. Others belonged to cemeteries, tombs, and the difficult passage between life and death. Egypt did not begin with one fixed doctrine of the afterlife and then simply preserve it. The picture developed gradually through local tradition, royal cult, temple practice, and funerary texts from different periods. That matters because Osiris did not enter an empty religious landscape. He rose within a world that already had language for fertility, burial, and the continuity of authority. Older gods in some regions carried parts of what later became the Osirian pattern. Kings were already associated with divine order. The dead were already thought to need support, protection, and proper rites. Agricultural life also made death and renewal visible every year in the fields and the flood cycle. Osiris eventually gathered many of these ideas together, but only over time. The earliest surviving evidence does not give a neat origin story. It shows a religion in motion. By the Old Kingdom, when the pyramid texts were carved in royal tombs, Osiris is already present, though often in fragments and assumptions rather than in a single complete myth. He appears in funerary formulas as a figure with authority in the hidden realm and as a power connected to the king's hoped-for survival after death. Even there, he belongs to a wider divine landscape. Other gods are active too, especially Ra in solar religion and a range of local powers linked to earth, sky, and protection of the dead. The pyramid texts matter because they show how early and how selective the evidence is. They do not explain Osiris from the beginning. They assume that some version of him is already known. Kingship was one of the most important religious ideas in early Egypt. The pharaoh was not simply a political ruler. He was a sacred mediator who upheld order in the land, that made royal theology central to the later development of Osiris. If death did not end the king's divine status, then the afterlife had to be imagined in a way that preserved authority, identity, and renewal. Osiris came to serve that need with unusual force. He became the god who could die, endure, and remain sovereign in another realm. Later Egyptian tradition could place the dead king in relation to Osiris so naturally because the god offered a model for continuity after rupture. Before Osiris fully took shape, Egypt already had deities that hinted at different pieces of that role. Some local gods were linked to grain and the life of the land. Others had funeral associations, still others guarded sacred places. In Egyptian religious memory, these functions were not always sharply divided. A god could belong to the soil, the tomb, and the throne at the same time. That flexibility helped Osirian theology grow later. It could absorb older meanings instead of replacing them all at once. Modern readers sometimes look for a single moment when Osiris became the god of the dead, but the sources point instead to a long process of accumulation. Functions that were once separate could be drawn together through ritual use, local devotion, and the authority of major cult centers. The same is true of the afterlife itself. Early Egyptian thought did not rely on one fixed model. The dead might be imagined as joining the stars, traveling with the sun, dwelling in a hidden underworld, or remaining near the tomb in a transformed condition. Different texts preserve different emphases. Royal mortuary literature tends to focus on ascent, transformation, and union with divine powers. Later funerary texts make the journey more explicit and more widely available. Osiris eventually becomes the central figure in that hidden realm, but the road to that status runs through older and less settled ideas. Some of those ideas were probably practical before they were theological. A cemetery needed guardians. A tomb needed offerings. A dead ruler needed language that could explain why he was not simply gone. Even burial practice points to this layered development. Egyptians cared deeply about preserving the body, supplying the dead, and maintaining relationships between the living and the deceased. Those practices did not come from Osiris alone. They belonged to a broader mortuary culture that preceded the full shape of his myth. Once Osiris became linked to the dead king and then to the dead generally, he gave those rites a divine explanation. Burial was no longer only an act of care, it became a way of participating in the god's own condition. Mummification, offering ritual, tomb maintenance, and spoken formulae all gained added meaning when understood in relation to a god who had passed through death and retained power. Later traditions would tell a more complete story. Osiris as king, Osiris as victim, Osiris as the one restored through ritual and remembered in death. But that story rests on older foundations. Early Egyptian religion had already prepared the key elements, even if it had not yet arranged them into one dominant myth. As Osiris took shape in Egyptian religion, he was not invented all at once. The evidence suggests a gradual development. Early Egypt had many local gods tied to towns, fields, tombs, and kingship traditions. Some protected fertility, some guarded the dead, and some stood close to the idea of rule itself. Osiris entered that landscape and came to hold those themes together. One clue comes from the oldest sources. In early royal and funerary texts, Osiris is already present as a powerful dead ruler, but not yet with all the later details attached to him. The story of his murder, restoration, and family conflict becomes clearer in later literature, especially in New Kingdom and First Millennium sources. Before that fuller narrative took shape, Osiris was already linked to the dead king and to the promise that death did not mean simple disappearance. That made him unusually important. He bridged the gap between burial and belief, between the tomb and continued existence. His connection to grain and the Nile helped that importance spread. In Egyptian thought, the yearly rhythm of the river, the return of crops, and the renewal of fields after inundation offered a natural way to think about life after death. Later tradition often presented Osiris as a god whose body, death, and return matched the agricultural cycle. The sources do not always preserve that symbolism in the same form, and scholars are careful about treating it as a single original meaning. Still, the association is strong enough to matter. Osiris became a god who could be understood through the visible order of the land itself. The grain that died in the ground and came back as harvest gave Egyptians a language for survival after death. That made him especially suitable for funerary religion. A local deity could protect a town or bless a crop. Osiris came to stand for something broader, the idea that rightful order survives disruption. He was tied to fertility, to kingship, and to the proper continuation of rule after death. Egyptian kings were expected to maintain Ma'at, the right balance of the world. As Osiris became more central, he came to embody that principle from the other side of death. He was the dead king, but also the god whose continued existence justified the hope that a dead ruler could remain effective in another realm. This mattered because Egyptian religion did not sharply separate politics from sacred life. A king who ruled well was not only a human leader, he was part of the divine pattern that held society together. Osiris fit that pattern in a new way. Instead of being a god of living power alone, he became the divine image of legitimate continuity after death. That is one reason his name grows steadily in importance across Egyptian texts. He was useful in explaining why the king's body had to be preserved, why offerings had to continue, and why death did not end sacred status. The earliest royal tomb traditions already show the outlines of this logic. In the Old Kingdom, the pyramid texts present a world in which the dead king is expected to ascend, join the gods, and retain a form of authority beyond the grave. Osiris appears there as a major divine presence associated with the underworld and with the dead ruler's fate. In those texts, however, he is not yet the fully narrated victim of later myth. He is more a sovereign of the dead than a character in a family drama. That difference matters. It shows that Osiris first gained importance not because of a single mythic episode, but because his name could authorize royal survival after death. His cult also seems to have grown through local centers that gave him a strong geographic identity. Abydos became especially important. By the Middle Kingdom and later, it was one of the most significant places associated with Osiris worship and burial memory. Pilgrimage to Abydos and the desire to connect a burial to Osiris there show how deeply his cult had entered Egyptian religious practice. The dead could be linked to him not only in texts, but through rites, monuments, and commemorative acts carried out in specific places. Once that happened, Osiris was no longer only a theological idea. He had become a god who shaped ritual behavior. Later Egyptians would tell a fuller story about how Osiris became ruler of the dead. But the rise of his cult began earlier and in more practical terms. He was attached to burial, to kingship, and to the fertility of the land because those were already urgent concerns. To see why Osiris became so important, it helps to begin with the divine family later stories placed around him. Egyptian myth did not start as a single fixed narrative. Different cult centers preserved different gods, and over time those local traditions were gathered into larger genealogies. In the best-known version, Osiris belongs to the line of Geb and Nut, the earth and the sky, with Isis, Set, and Nephthys as his siblings. That structure is clear in later religious texts, but it was not necessarily ancient in exactly that form. It organized older beliefs into a story about rule, inheritance, death, and restoration. Geb and Nut place the Osiris myth inside the structure of the cosmos itself. Geb is the earth, Nut is the sky, and their children belong to the space between them, the world where human life takes place. In later tradition, this family pattern helps explain why kingship passes from one generation to the next, and why death is not simply an end but a transition into another form of authority. Osiris becomes the sun who embodies legitimate rule. Set becomes the force that breaks it. Isis becomes the power of loyalty, knowledge, and ritual skill. Nephthys is more shadowed in the surviving stories, but she belongs to the same household and often appears near mourning, protection, and funerary aid. The roles of these gods sharpen over time. Isis, in particular, grows into one of the most important deities in Egyptian religion, but in the Osiris cycle, she first appears as a figure of intelligence and devotion. She is not only a grieving wife in later art and literature, she is also the one who understands spells, names, and hidden things. That matters because Egyptian religion often treated knowledge as power in a literal sense. To know the right divine name, to speak the right formula, to perform the correct rite was to take part in the structure of the world. Isis represents that kind of sacred competence. In some texts, she is even more effective because of it than any god who rules by force. Her authority comes through speech, memory, and exact ritual action. Set is more complicated than a simple villain. Later readers often reduce him to a demon of evil, but the older tradition is less neat. Set is associated with violence, disruption, and the breaking of social order, yet he is also a powerful god with his own sphere. In some early contexts, he was not an outsider at all. He belonged to the divine world of Egypt. The conflict with Osiris is therefore not a simple moral tale with one good god and one bad god. It is closer to a struggle over who may rule, who may inherit, and what kind of force keeps the cosmos stable. That is one reason the story lasted. It could explain political succession without treating succession as purely human. It also absorbed later tensions, especially in periods when Set's image changed under shifting political and religious alliances. In one era, he could be honored in some regions as a strong and necessary god. In another, he could stand more clearly for disorder. Nephthys is often overlooked, but she gives the family its funerary depth. In later tradition, she is linked to lamentation, boundary spaces, and protection of the dead. She often appears beside Isis in scenes of mourning, and the two sisters become a paired presence at the edge of death. Their names recur in funerary contexts because they stand for the care given to the dead after loss has already occurred. If Osiris is the dead king, Isis and Nephthys are the figures who make the dead king ritually legible. They do not erase death, they respond to it. In temple and tomb contexts, this mattered because Egyptian funerary practice depended on orderly words, gestures, and offerings. The goddesses stand for that patient work of recognition, the work of making a death answerable to ritual rather than leaving it in silence. This family structure also explains why the Osiris story became so useful across Egyptian history. It connects the royal house to the gods in a direct line. It explains why the king can be associated with Horus while also being identified after death with Osiris. It gives mourning a divine model. It gives succession a sacred pattern, and it allows the dead to be placed within a family drama rather than left as isolated bodies. In that sense, the myth is not only about one god's fate, it is about how Egyptians imagined continuity itself. The dead do not simply disappear from the social order, they are folded into a larger one, expressed in royal ideology, tomb inscriptions, hymns, and mortuary ritual. That connection to kingship is one reason the family genealogy mattered so much. In the Old Kingdom and later periods, Egyptian rulers were not merely political figures. They were tied to divine order, and the language of descent helped explain that tie. Horus, the son who will eventually stand against Set, becomes the living emblem of kingship, while Osiris becomes the deceased ruler who legitimizes the throne through death and renewal. The relationship between father and son turns into a political model. A king dies, his heir succeeds him, and the older ruler is not abandoned but transformed into a divine ancestor. The myth gives that process a sacred shape. By the time the story is told in its fuller form, the family is no longer a background detail. Geb, Nut, Isis, Set, and Nephthys are the framework that makes the drama possible. Once Osiris enters the tradition as a ruler, he is not remembered simply as one king among others. He becomes the model of what kingship should be. Later Egyptian sources describe him as a civilizing god, the one who brings settled life where there had been uncertainty. In those accounts, he teaches people to cultivate grain, respect law, and live under ordered rule rather than violence. The details vary from text to text, and not every version follows the same sequence, but the pattern is steady. Osiris stands for the kind of authority that makes Egypt seem stable and intelligible. That idea fits Egyptian religion closely. Egypt depended on the regular flooding of the Nile, the timing of planting and harvest, and the maintenance of social order. So when later traditions present Osiris as a god tied to agriculture and renewal, they are not adding a random detail. They are linking him to the basic rhythms of Egyptian life. Grain rises from the earth, is cut down, and returns in another season. A ruler dies, but the office remains. The dead are laid in the ground, but they are also imagined as continuing in another form. Osiris gathers those meanings into one figure. This agricultural language matters because it appears in a culture that watched the land change season by season. Egyptian funerary texts often use the language of planting, growth, and emergence to describe survival after death, and Osiris became a natural focus for those ideas. He was connected with fertility not simply because he stood for abundance, but because he embodied the promise that what is lost can also be restored in a different form. That is one reason he appears so often in tomb contexts and in rites concerned with renewal. The dead person is not expected to return to ordinary life, but to enter a transformed existence that still depends on order, continuity, and remembrance. Osiris becomes the ruler of that condition. In some traditions, this is why his reign is remembered as a golden time. He does not merely possess power, he uses it properly. He is said to establish norms, guide people towards settled behavior, and replace disorder with structure. Egyptian kingship was always more than administration. It was a sacred office that had to reflect cosmic balance, often expressed through Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, and proper order. Osiris becomes one of the clearest mythic images of that principle. A good king does not rule by force alone. He sustains the world's balance. That also makes his reign vulnerable in the myth. If Osiris represents rightful rule, then Set can be understood as the force that resents or challenges it. In some versions, Set is not a simple embodiment of evil. Egyptian myth is usually less tidy than that. He can be linked with the desert, storms, foreignness, and disruptive power, though those associations shift over time and from one text to another. Still, in the Osiris cycle, his role becomes clear. He is the brother who cannot accept the order Osiris represents. The tension is not only personal, it is political and cosmic. The story turns on the question of whether rightful kingship can remain secure. This is why the Osiris myth became so important for royal ideology. Pharaohs were associated with Horus in life and with Osiris in death, so the story offered a divine explanation for succession. The living king held power as Horus, the victorious heir. The dead king passed into Osiris, the ruler who had already crossed into death. The system connected continuity with loss. One ruler dies, another takes his place, and the institution survives. Osiris makes that transition sacred rather than merely administrative. In temple and tomb contexts, that connection helped explain why kingship was not broken by death but renewed through it. The successor did not erase the dead ruler. Instead, the dead ruler remained part of the structure that made monarchy legitimate in the first place. At the same time, later Egyptian tradition could describe Osiris as a king who brought civilization itself. That belongs to mythic memory, not recoverable history. It shows how Egyptians understood the religious value of kingship. A just ruler did not only collect tribute or command armies, he made life possible. He supported agriculture, kept law in place, and maintained the conditions under which society could continue. In that sense, Osiris is not just a figure in a tragedy that ends in murder and mourning. He is the height of the world before it breaks. The sources that preserve this picture do so in different registers. Temple inscriptions, funerary spells, and later literary retellings do not always place the emphasis in the same way. Some stress his kingship, some his death and restoration, and some his role in the underworld. But the underlying connection remains consistent. Osiris is the figure through whom Egyptian religion could speak about order surviving collapse, that mattered in a civilization where kingship, agriculture, and burial practice were closely linked. A field had to be worked at the right time, a ruler had to be recognized as legitimate, and the dead had to be properly prepared for what came next. Osiris belonged to all three of those worlds. So by the time the story reaches its fuller form, Osiris is already more than a deity of fertility or death. Set enters the Osiris story as the figure who makes order visible by threatening it. In later retellings, especially in the tradition preserved by authors such as Plutarch, much later than the earliest Egyptian religious texts, the contrast between the two brothers becomes sharper than a simple family dispute. Osiris represents settled rule, cultivation, and continuity. Set stands for disturbance, violence, and the part of existence that resists control. Egyptian sources do not always treat that opposition in the same moral way, and Set should not be flattened into a pure villain from the start. In earlier material, he is also a powerful god with his own domain and a legitimate place in the divine order. He is not outside the system, he is part of it. That is what makes the conflict serious. This is not a stranger attacking a king. It is an internal rupture within the divine family itself. The sources suggest that Set's hostility grows out of a struggle over status and succession. Osiris has the stability of kingship, and that stability creates a problem for anyone who wants power outside established order. In some versions, the rivalry is tied to who should rule after the older generation. In others, it is framed more broadly as resentment toward Osiris's excellence and public approval. Egyptian mythology rarely gives a single psychological explanation in the modern sense. Instead, it preserves a pattern of events that explains why cosmic and political disorder exists at all. Set's resentment matters because it is attached to a royal household. The crisis begins where rule should have been secure. Later tradition sometimes expands this tension into a symbolic opposition between Egypt's ordered land and the dangerous margins beyond it, but that idea belongs to a developed theological way of thinking, not necessarily to the oldest form of the tale. Still, the broad logic is clear. Osiris belongs to fertility, measured time, and right succession. Set belongs to disruption, broken continuity, and the interruption of normal life. Their rivalry gives mythic shape to experiences Egyptians knew well: the fragility of kingship, the threat of violence, and the fact that order must be maintained rather than assumed. Set's place in the wider religious landscape is also important. Egyptian gods were not always neatly divided into heroes and enemies. A deity could have local prestige, ritual importance, and mythic hostility all at once. Set was worshipped in some regions and periods as a strong and necessary power, especially in connection with the desert, storms, and royal force. That makes the Osiris conflict more historically revealing. It shows how Egyptian religion could preserve tension rather than erase it. Set is not merely evil in a later moral sense. He is a force that can be dangerous, but also a force that belongs to the world Egyptians were trying to understand. This is why the story of the brothers matters so much to the later Underworld tradition. Once Osiris becomes the ideal king, Set's opposition is no longer just one episode in a divine family drama. It becomes the pattern for how death itself is imagined. The king who should have continued ruling is now vulnerable to betrayal. In some versions, Set is motivated by envy of Osiris's power. In others, the exact motive matters less than the breach itself. The larger point stays the same. The Egyptian universe contains a fracture, and that fracture begins with the breakdown of divine kinship. The myth does not linger on simple enmity. It moves towards strategy. Set does not overthrow Osiris in open combat, at least not in the best-known versions. He turns to deception. That choice matters. It suggests that disorder in the Egyptian imagination often works by taking advantage of trust, ceremony, and shared custom. The catastrophe comes not from an outside invasion, but from the misuse of a social occasion. By the time the banquet arrives, the conflict has already become something more than rivalry. It has become a hidden attack on the conditions that make kingship possible. Ancient Egyptian texts preserve this tension in different ways. Some royal and funerary compositions refer to Set as an enemy, because the dead king is identified with Osiris, and the afterlife demands that the forces opposed to Osiris be overcome. Other material, including traditions from the New Kingdom and later, keeps Set's broader identity intact, even while acknowledging his dangerous role. That distinction matters because it shows that Egyptian myth was not a single fixed tale. It was a body of related stories shaped by ritual use, local theology, and changing political needs. In one context, Set could appear as the murderer. In another, he could still be a god with a place in temple worship and royal symbolism. The rivalry also reflects something concrete about kingship in Egypt. The king was not only a ruler in political terms, he was the guarantor of right order, linked to crop cycles, temple offerings, and the public stability that kept society intact. If Osiris embodies that ideal, then Set's challenge is not limited to a family quarrel. It threatens the idea that rulership can pass cleanly from one generation to the next. Egyptian audiences would have recognized the seriousness of that threat. A disrupted succession was not an abstract problem. It could lead to instability, contested authority, and the collapse of ritual regularity. The myth turns those concerns into divine biography, so that the breakdown of order is remembered as something that happened first at the level of the gods. Some later retellings sharpen the psychological edge of the conflict and make Set's envy more explicit. That version is easier to follow, but it should not be mistaken for the earliest layer of the tradition. The older evidence does not always explain why Set acts as he does. It presents the result, a god who resents the stability of another god and chooses a path that undermines it. That restraint is part of the power of the myth. In the best-known version of the myth, Set does not seize power by force alone. He uses hospitality. Osiris is invited to a banquet, a setting that should confirm rank rather than threaten it. That is what makes the trick work. The attack depends on custom. Set has a chest or coffin made to exact measurements, often described as finely crafted and fitted to Osiris alone. It looks like a gift, but it has been designed as a trap at the feast. Set and his companions praise the chest and say that whoever fits it perfectly may keep it as a prize. One guest after another tries it, but it belongs to none of them. When Osiris lies down inside, the deception is complete. The fit is exact. In some tellings, the conspirators shut the lid at once and fasten it with nails or molten lead. In others, they seal it more simply but with the same finality. The method changes, but the meaning does not. Osiris is enclosed, cut off and made helpless by an object prepared for him in advance. This scene is clearest in later literary retellings, especially the version preserved by Plutarch many centuries after the earliest Egyptian religious texts. That matters. Modern readers should not treat every detail as equally ancient. What stays consistent across the tradition is the basic structure of the event. Set uses a measured chest to remove Osiris from the living world. The image endured because it compresses so much into one moment. Kingship is reduced to a body, community becomes a trap. Place meant to display honor becomes the means of disappearance. The chest is often treated as a coffin, and in some later retellings the distinction fades. That makes sense because the object already carries the logic of burial. A coffin is made for containment, for fixing a boundary around the body. In Egyptian thought, boundaries mattered. The proper treatment of the dead was part of the order that separated the living from the dead, the protected from the vulnerable, and the legitimate ruler from the one who had been cast out. Set weaponizes that logic by using a funerary form before funerary rites should ever apply. There is also a practical reason the story depends on a measured chest. Ancient Egyptian elite culture valued craftsmanship, exactness, and fitted design in objects associated with rank. A container made to Osiris's measurements is not only tailored, it shows that his body has already been singled out and accounted for. The trap works because the measurement implies knowledge and intimacy. Set has not acted blindly. He is prepared in advance for the moment when Osiris will trust the honor of the occasion. Once the lid closes, the story shifts from rivalry to irreversible loss. Osiris is no longer present at court, no longer active in the world he helped order. In some versions, the chest is thrown into the Nile immediately. In others, the conspirators carry it away first and then release it to the river. However the action is arranged, the result is the same. The god of rightful rule has been placed inside a sealed container and pushed beyond the reach of ordinary rescue. That movement toward the river widens the story. The betrayal does not stay inside a palace or banquet hall. It enters the landscape of Egypt itself. The Nile is a source of life, transport and exchange, but here it becomes the path by which a ruler is removed from human contact. Later traditions will carry the chest farther still, sometimes describing it drifting to foreign shores, but the essential pattern is already present. Osiris is no longer where he should be, and the world has to respond to that absence. The image also fits Egyptian concerns about boundaries. A coffin is meant to contain the dead, but here it arrives before death in the usual sense of burial ritual and family mourning. It becomes an instrument of violation rather than protection. Later Egyptian funerary practice would place enormous importance on preserving the body and maintaining the proper transition into the next world. This myth reverses that expectation at the critical moment. Osiris is not prepared for burial by his family. He is imprisoned by an enemy using the shape of a burial object. The banquet intensifies the breach. Food, ceremony, and shared presence all suggest order. Set turns those forms against Osiris. That is why the episode is more than a murder plot. It is a statement about how disruption enters the world. It does not always appear as open war. Sometimes it enters through invitation, through custom, through the abuse of something that was supposed to be safe. There is also a political edge to the scene. Osiris is not only a divine figure in this telling, he stands for legitimate rule. Set's violence is not random. It is an assault on the principle that power should pass in an ordered way. The banquet becomes a stage on which rightful authority is undermined from within. The assembled guests are not merely witnesses, they form the social frame that lets the fraud succeed. After Osiris is sealed inside the chest, the story shifts from deception to disappearance. In the best-known version, the chest is carried away by water, and the point is not only that Osiris has been killed, but that he has been removed beyond ordinary reach. Egyptian tradition preserves more than one path for that journey. Some later accounts say the coffin drifted through the Nile and then out toward the sea, beyond Egypt itself. Others keep the emphasis closer to home and simply say the body was taken downstream and hidden when no one could easily recover it. The details vary, but the meaning stays the same. Osiris is no longer present where he belongs. That movement matters because the Nile was never just a river in Egyptian thought. It was the main route of transport, settlement, agriculture, and religious life. To send Osiris into the water is to send him along the central artery of the land. A body lost to the river is not merely hidden. It is carried beyond the control of family, temple, and court. In a culture where funerary care depended on correct handling and timely rites, this is a severe violation. The myth makes the loss feel total by taking Osiris out of the human sphere and into the landscape that connected Egypt together. The same waterway that fed the fields and bound the kingdom now becomes the route by which its king is removed. For Egyptian listeners, that detail would have carried practical and religious force. A proper burial was not a minor matter. It was the condition that allowed the dead to receive offerings, preserve identity, and enter the next state of existence with dignity. A body lost to the water could not be placed in a tomb, wrapped, named, or tended in the ordinary way. The myth, therefore, uses the Nile to create an extreme version of bereavement. Osiris is not simply struck down in a hidden chamber. He is carried away from the routines that make death manageable. The river prevents closure. Later retellings sometimes add another layer. The coffin, they say, travels beyond Egypt and reaches foreign shores. In a version preserved by Plutarch much later than the oldest Egyptian sources, it comes to Byblos, where it is embedded in a tree and eventually taken into the service of a local king. That is not the earliest form of the story, but it shows how the myth could expand as Egyptian religion met the wider Eastern Mediterranean. Byblos mattered to Egyptians because it was a real trading center, and later traditions often linked divine events to places that had commercial and diplomatic value. Even in those versions, the key idea remains concealment. Osiris is not simply dead, he has become hidden, and hiddenness is what makes him recoverable. The older Egyptian sources are less interested in geography than in consequence. Once the chest is gone, the world that knew Osiris as king is left without him. The royal line has been broken, and the god who stood for ordered rule has been cut off in a way that cannot be undone by force alone. At this stage of the story, no one has restored him yet. No ritual has reassembled what was lost. The absence itself becomes the crisis. This is one reason the myth mattered so deeply in Egyptian religious thought. It does not rush immediately to resurrection. It first makes the absence weighty enough to matter. That is what allows Isis to enter the narrative with full force. She is not yet the magical helper of later funerary theology. First, she is the figure who recognizes that the loss cannot be ignored. She searches because disappearance is not the same as annihilation. The body may be hidden, but as long as it exists somewhere, it can still be sought. That idea shapes the next phase of the myth. Before there can be mourning rites, before there can be embalming, before Osiris can become Lord of the Dead, there must be recovery. The river has taken him away, and Egypt is left with absence, uncertainty, and the beginning of a search. The search also helps explain why the story of Osiris is so closely tied to kingship. In Egyptian belief, the king was not just a political ruler. He was a stabilizing figure whose survival protected the order of the world. When Osiris is removed, that order is interrupted. The myth does not describe a private family tragedy alone. It describes a breakdown in legitimate rule. The chest on the river becomes a sign that power has slipped from its rightful place and moved into concealment. Whoever now holds authority in the story must recover what was lost or endure the consequences of its absence. That is why later Egyptian religion could use this part of the myth in funerary settings. Isis enters the story as both mourner and investigator. In later tradition, she is Osiris's wife, but she is more than a grieving figure beside a tomb. She refuses to let loss remain private. Once Osiris is gone, she begins to search for him, and that search gives the myth its next movement. The story is no longer only about betrayal and removal. It becomes about persistence, memory, and the effort to recover what has been taken away. Egyptian sources do not preserve one single earliest version of this search. The broad shape is clear, but the details change from text to text. In some retellings, Isis travels widely in human or divine disguise. In others, she gathers information through questioning, prayer, or the help of other gods. What matters is that the search is active and deliberate. She does not wait for Osiris to return on his own. She goes after the hidden body, because recovery begins with finding where loss has been carried. That idea matters in Egyptian religion because the dead were not always imagined as simply gone. A body that remained intact, or at least recoverable, still belonged to the world of ritual. It could be named, wrapped, lamented, offered to, and moved into a new sacred status. Isis stands at the center of that possibility. Her grief is not passive. It becomes a force that resists disappearance. Later tradition often emphasizes her skill as much as her sorrow. Isis is one of the great magical figures of Egyptian myth, especially in funerary literature of the New Kingdom and later. But in the Osiris story, the search comes before the full display of magic. She is the one who tracks, learns, and endures. In some versions, she is helped by Nephthys, her sister, who joins the lament and the search. In others, the journey is solitary or only partly shared. The sources agree on the larger point. Osiris does not remain lost because Isis refuses to treat absence as final. This is also where the myth begins to move beyond kingship into ritual devotion. A king has been taken, but a wife is searching for a husband. A divine ruler has vanished, but mourning has not ended. That transition matters because Egyptian funerary belief often joined political order and family grief together. What happens to Osiris is not only a problem for the gods, it becomes a pattern for how the living respond to death itself. In that sense, the search answers a practical religious question. If a person has died, what can still be done for them? The story suggests that the first duty is not explanation but retrieval, or at least the attempt to retrieve what death has separated. Some later retellings give the search a more specific geography. The coffin is said to have drifted far from Egypt, and Isis follows the trail beyond the Nile Valley. Other versions keep the movement more general, because the point is not the itinerary, the point is distance. Osiris has been carried out of reach, and Isis must cross that distance through persistence rather than force. The myth treats that pursuit as worthy in itself. It is the first stage of restoration, and without it the rest of the story cannot begin. This also helps explain why later Egyptian tradition associated Isis with healing, protection, and magical knowledge. These are not separate traits added afterward. They grow out of her role here. A figure who searches for the dead must know how to move between places, how to gather what is scattered, and how to resist the erosion of time. In funerary texts and temple traditions, Isis becomes the one who can speak effective words over danger and death. Her power is not detached from grief, it is shaped by it. The search also creates a strong contrast with Set's action. Set has acted in a sudden violent way, using ambush and concealment. Isis answers with patience, she follows signs, listens to reports, and continues after the trail seems to have gone cold. That difference matters because the myth is not only about a conflict between gods, it is also about different forms of action. One destroys by interruption, the other repairs by sustained attention. Egyptian audiences would have understood the value of that distinction in daily life, where preserving a body, a name, or a family line depended on careful labor rather than dramatic force. In some traditions, the search extends beyond Egypt and into neighboring lands, especially in retellings that connect the story to Byblos and the cedar tree, later associated with the chest containing Osiris. Those versions appear most clearly in later literary sources, especially Greek accounts of Egyptian myth, and they reflect how the tale was adapted for different audiences. Even there, the underlying logic stays the same. Isis does not simply lament what is lost. In some versions, Isis does not search at random. She follows clues, worship, and trade routes, moving through places where Egyptian religion already had a presence, or where later storytellers wanted to place a memory of Osiris's far travel. The best-known foreign setting is Byblos on the Levantine coast. In later Greek retellings, especially Plutarch's account, the body or coffin of Osiris is said to have been carried by the sea and lodged in a tree or a royal enclosure. This is a later tradition, not the oldest surviving Egyptian form, but it became one of the most influential versions of the search. It gave the myth a wider geography and made Osiris into a god whose loss reached beyond Egypt itself. It also reflected long contact between Egypt and the Levant, where timber, luxury goods, and diplomacy created a setting later audiences could recognize as plausible. Other traditions keep the story closer to home. In those accounts, Isis recovers the coffin after long searching within Egypt, sometimes with the help of local knowledge, divine assistance, or sudden recognition of a hidden place. The details change from source to source, but the structure stays the same. Osiris is not recovered through battle, he is found through perseverance. That matters because the myth is not only about a dead god, it is about the labor of gathering what has been taken apart. The search itself becomes a sacred act, and later Egyptians could recognize in it the work of burial, lamentation, and remembrance. It also mirrors a practical truth of funerary life. Bodies were prepared, wrapped, named, and placed with care because disorder after death had to be answered by ritual order. The coffin is important in its own right. It is more than a container. In the story, it marks the difference between a body that can be cared for and a body that has been lost to ordinary mourning. In Egyptian funerary practice, preserving the dead was a serious religious duty, and the image of Isis seeking the coffin gave that duty a mythic frame. Wooden coffins, stone sarcophagi, and burial chambers all served to hold and protect the body, but they also carried symbolic force. They were boundaries between the visible world and the hidden one. When the myth dwells on the coffin, it is not incidental detail. It is a way of saying that the dead can be approached only through proper forms. When she finds Osiris, she has not yet restored him. She has only made restoration possible. That distinction keeps the story grounded. Finding is not the same as reviving, and the myth does not rush past the difficulty. Some versions suggest that Isis initially receives the coffin under cover of concealment, or that the local ruler does not understand what has been found. In Byblos traditions, the divine body can be hidden inside a tree or wrapped into a royal structure before Isis identifies it. The point is not the exact furniture of the scene. It is the repeated pattern of recognition. Osiris is present, but disguised by distance, death, and enclosure. Isis must read the signs correctly before she can act. This kind of recognition is central to Egyptian religion more broadly, where names, forms, and materials had to be identified properly for ritual to work. A god hidden in wood, in a box, or in a sealed place is still accessible, but only if the searcher knows how to interpret what is in front of her. This is one reason the myth became so durable. It describes a loss that is not final, but it does not pretend recovery is easy. The dead are not simply returned by wish or command. They must be located, recognized, and protected. In some later accounts, Isis uses knowledge that others lack. In others, she relies on endurance and divine favor. The differences matter because they show how the story could be told as both devotion and skill. She is a grieving wife, but also a figure of ritual intelligence. She knows how to search, how to identify, and how to begin repair. That combination made her especially important in Egyptian religion, where effective mourning was not passive. It required proper actions performed with patience, and the myth gave those actions divine precedent. The search also helps explain why Osiris became so closely tied to kingship and burial. A missing ruler is not only a private loss. In Egyptian thought, he stands for the vulnerability of ordered life itself. When Osiris is hidden, the world is missing something essential. When Isis finds him, even before the later acts of dismemberment and reassembly, the story affirms that what has been taken away can still be traced. That is a comforting idea, but it is also a demanding one. It asks for memory, not denial. It asks for attention to signs, not fantasy of effortless recovery. In the most familiar version of the myth, Set does not stop with Osiris's disappearance. He finds the body again, and that recovery leads to a second act of violence, one more deliberate than the first. The sources do not always tell the story in exactly the same way, but they agree on the larger point. Once Set has control of the corpse, he destroys any simple hope that Osiris might return whole and unchanged. The clearest full account survives in later literary sources, especially the Greek tradition associated with Plutarch, writing many centuries after the earliest Egyptian texts. Those retellings are valuable, but they are not the earliest form of the myth. Egyptian funerary and temple texts preserve pieces of the story rather than one continuous narrative. Even so, they show Osiris becoming a figure of dismemberment and repair, and that matters as much as the murder itself. The body is no longer merely missing. It has been broken apart. In some versions, Set discovers the coffin, opens it, and tears the body into pieces. In others, the dismemberment follows after the coffin has already been hidden or moved. The sequence changes from source to source, but Set's role does not. He does not simply kill his brother and leave the matter there. He turns death into fragmentation. That changes the logic of the myth, because a hidden body can still be found, but scattered remains require search, memory, and ritual labor. The number of pieces varies, and that variation is important. Later Greek authors often speak of 14 parts, but Egyptian local traditions do not always preserve the same count, and some regions attach their own meanings to particular body parts. The number itself is less important than the pattern behind it. Osiris is divided into pieces that can be sought separately, which lets the myth connect each recovered fragment with a specific place, and in some cases with a local cult. A body that is broken can be distributed across the landscape, and that distribution helps explain why different towns and temples claimed special ties to Osiris. This is one reason the myth was so adaptable. It did not only explain death, It also explained sacred geography. Places could say that they held one part of Osiris or that they preserved the memory of where a fragment had been found. In later tradition, this gave Egypt a map of loss and recovery. The god's body was not confined to a single tomb. It was remembered through a network of sites, each folded into the wider story. The violence is also symbolic. Set's action is often read as an attack on order itself. Osiris had represented rightful kingship, continuity, and the stable rule that held society together. By breaking his body, Set breaks that continuity in physical form. The myth turns political conflict into anatomy. Disorder is no longer abstract. It is a corpse cut apart. At the same time, the story should not be reduced to a simple moral contrast between good and evil. Egyptian myth often works through tensions that are more specific than that. Set is not merely a villain in every context. In other traditions, he could be linked to strength, desert power, or necessary force. But within the Osiris cycle, especially in funerary tradition, he becomes the agent of rupture. The second crime matters because it turns a death into a condition that must be ritually answered. Osiris cannot be restored by recognition alone. His remains must be gathered. That is why this stage of the myth leads directly into the work of Isis and the other mourners. The search changes once the body has been divided. What had been recovery becomes collection. The story moves from concealment to scattering, and from the hope of finding a single intact corpse to the harder task of reassembling what has been deliberately broken. Osiris is no longer simply a lost king. He has become a scattered divine corpse, and from this point onward, every act of mourning, every spell, and every funeral rite will be shaped by that fact. The later sources make that shift feel dramatic, but the underlying idea fits Egyptian religious practice closely. The dead were not only buried, they were protected, named, wrapped, and reassembled in ritual language because wholeness mattered. Funerary texts often insist on bodily integrity, even when the body has plainly decayed. The myth of Osiris gives that concern a divine model. If the god of the dead has been torn apart, then the work of priests and mourners is not symbolic decoration. It is a response to a problem built into the myth itself. Restoration begins only after destruction has been made complete. This also helps explain why the story carries such weight in the broader Egyptian understanding of the afterlife. A body that is hidden might still be recovered as a body. A body that is scattered requires another kind of victory. It demands that Isis, Nephthys, and sometimes other figures move through the world collecting what remains. In later tradition, that search becomes part of the god's eventual rebirth, but at this point there is no easy reassurance. The second crime delays any return and makes the eventual restoration more difficult, more sacred, and more dependent on ritual knowledge. The myth does not present that violence as random. Set's act is purposeful because it attacks the conditions under which kingship, burial, and remembrance can continue. A king's body was not only a body, it was a political and religious center. In breaking Osiris apart, Set tries to prevent him from becoming a lasting ruler in death as he had been in life. He tries to stop the continuity that would let Osiris endure beyond his murder. The irony is that the attempt fails. The fragmentation becomes part of Osiris's power. What Set meant as final destruction becomes the form through which Osiris enters funerary religion. Once Set has turned the murder into dismemberment, the myth becomes a search. In Egyptian thought, that search was never only about recovering a body. It was also about restoring the conditions death had broken. A dead king had to be gathered, named, protected, and made whole enough to enter the next state. That is why the figures who appear around Osiris at this stage are not just relatives in a family story, they are ritual figures. Isis, Nephthys, Anubis, and in some traditions, other divine helpers take part in the work of finding what has been lost. The sources do not preserve a single fixed map of where the body pieces were taken. Local traditions differed, and Egyptian religion often allowed more than one sacred place to claim a role in the myth. Some versions emphasize that Isis traveled through Egypt in search of Osiris. Others extend the story farther, sending his remains through foreign lands or towards sacred centers beyond Egypt itself. Later temple traditions could link different pieces to different cult sites, each one preserving its own memory of the god's recovery. The important point is the pattern, not a modern demand for exact sequence. Osiris has been broken apart, and each fragment becomes a place where mourning turns into sacred labor. In some tellings, Isis is the chief searcher because she is the one who refuses to accept the finality of loss. She is not passive grief, she is skilled searching, patient collection, and ritual intelligence. Nephthys, who is often paired with Isis in mourning scenes, helps lament the dead king and support the work of restoration. Anubis appears as well, especially where embalming and protection of the corpse are concerned. The myth widens around Osiris, and that widening reflects the way Egyptian funerary practice itself involved many divine powers acting together. No single figure does everything. Recovery is collective, and it is gradual. The dead king does not return to order in one sudden moment, but through repeated acts of finding, binding, guarding, and naming. Because the body has been broken into pieces, the search is also a matter of boundaries. A fragment is not the whole, but it still belongs to the whole. That idea mattered in Egyptian ritual thought. A name, a limb, a wrapping, a preserved shape, each could carry religious force. So when a tradition says that Isis finds a piece of Osiris in one place and another piece somewhere else, it is not simply making the story more dramatic. It is showing how sacred wholeness can be approached through partial recovery. The body does not need to be ignored in order to be transformed. It needs to be found, gathered, and cared for. In that sense, the search mirrors the logic of mummification itself, where protecting the form was a way of preserving identity across death. That logic also explains why the myth could be tied so closely to funeral customs. Egyptian burial practice placed great value on keeping the dead recognizable. The body was wrapped, protected, and supplied with the words and signs needed for survival beyond the grave. The Osiris story turns that same concern into divine narrative. What priests did for ordinary dead people, the gods do for Osiris on a cosmic scale. His scattered body becomes the model for what must be repaired in every burial: continuity, integrity, and proper placement within the sacred order. One of the best-known variations places part of the story far from Egypt, in Byblos. In that version, the coffin or chest containing Osiris is carried to the Levantine coast, where it becomes embedded in a tree or enclosed within a pillar-like structure before Isis recovers it. This is a later form of the myth in the surviving literary tradition, and it shows how the Osiris story could absorb foreign geography without losing its central meaning. Even when the setting changes, the underlying concern remains the same. The hidden body must be located and brought back under sacred control. The presence of Byblos also reminds us that Egyptian stories did not exist in isolation. They could be reshaped through contact with wider Eastern Mediterranean trade and cultural memory. Byblos was a real and important place in the networks that linked the Nile Valley with the Levant, so its appearance in the tale gives the myth a broader horizon. Other traditions keep the search closer to Egypt. In those versions, Isis and Nephthys move through the land, finding pieces that have been hidden, dropped, or deliberately dispersed. The details vary because local cult places had their own claims. A shrine might preserve the memory of a fragment, a burial place, or a symbolic recovery. Egyptians were comfortable with that kind of layered tradition. A myth did not have to be reduced to one official route if several sacred centers could be tied to different aspects of the same divine event. That flexibility mattered in temple religion, where stories often reinforced the importance of particular regions, shrines, and priestly lineages without erasing older versions. The fragmentation itself also carries a political and religious edge. A divided body is not only a sign of murder, it is a sign of disorder in the world that Set has produced. In Egyptian thought, enemies of kingship were enemies of stability, and the mutilation of Osiris dramatizes that threat in extreme form. To search for the pieces is therefore to push back against chaos. The search is not merely private mourning, it is an act that begins to reverse an attack on order itself. Each recovered piece says that violence has limits and that ritual care can answer it. What matters in every version is that the search succeeds enough to allow the next act. The fragments are not simply mourned, they are gathered into a condition where restoration becomes possible. The work of Isis, Nephthys, Anubis, and the other helpers changes the meaning of the myth. Osiris is no longer only a victim of violence. At this point, the story shifts from recovery to lament. It is not enough that Osiris has been found in some form. He must be honored, protected, and ritually addressed. Isis and Nephthys come forward here not only as grieving relatives, but as skilled mourners whose words have power. Their laments do more than express sorrow. They mark the violence done to Osiris, call attention to his absence, and help draw him back toward an ordered state in which restoration can begin. This is one reason the Osiris story mattered so deeply in Egyptian religion. Death was not treated as a single event that ended all concern. It was a condition that required care. The body needed tending, the soul needed support. The divine world had to be approached with the right words in the right sequence by people who understood ritual. In that setting, mourning was not passive. It was an act. The lamentations of Isis and Nephthys became a model for grief turned into sacred service. Later funerary texts preserve this role clearly. In temple and mortuary traditions, the sisters are often shown as the chief mourners at Osiris's body, calling him back in songs and cries that join sorrow to efficacy. The key point is not whether every version of the myth places each line of lament in exactly the same way. The key point is that Egyptian ritual imagination treated spoken words as forceful. A lament could protect, it could awaken memory, it could help create the conditions for rebirth. The same culture that valued embalming also valued sacred speech, because the spoken formula was part of what made the rite successful. This is especially clear in the mortuary literature that survives from different periods. In the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and later the Book of the Dead are repeatedly named, addressed, and assisted through formulas that assume language has practical effect in the next world. The Osiris myth gives those formulas a divine pattern. If the god himself can be mourned into a state of renewed life, then the human dead can also be helped by correct ritual speech. That belief does not reduce lament to poetry. It makes lament part of the machinery of survival. Isis, especially, becomes the figure who joins grief to intelligence. She searches, she mourns, and she speaks the spells that make restoration possible. In some traditions, she is the great sorceress of the gods, though that should not be taken in a modern fantasy sense. What the sources show is a religious idea that speech, knowledge, and ritual precision can affect the state of the dead. Isis does not merely ask for help. She knows the names, the formulas, and the proper invocations. That knowledge makes her central to the recovery of Osiris. She is the one who can turn loss into a recoverable condition. That role also reflects a wider Egyptian pattern linking divine knowledge with protective labor. Isis is not only a widow, she becomes a ritual specialist, a guardian of continuity, and later a healer associated with protection in household and funerary settings. In some late traditions, she is connected with the recovery of Osiris's body through magical skill after his dismemberment and concealment. But the exact details vary by source and period. What remains stable is her function. She is the figure who does not accept death as final, and who knows how to challenge its hold through authorized words and actions. Nephthys serves alongside her as another mourner and helper, often paired with Isis in funerary scenes and mourning rituals. Their relationship in the sources is consistent, even when the details are not. They are the sisters who stand over the dead god, naming what has happened and insisting that he be preserved. In later Egyptian practice, their presence at funerals and in ritual recitations reflects this mythic role. They help create a sacred frame in which death is acknowledged but not left untouched. Some texts present them almost as ritual bookends, one at the head and one at the foot of the bier, surrounding the dead with voice protection. That image mattered because enclosure itself was a powerful symbol in Egyptian funerary thought. To guard, to bind, to keep harm away, and to hold what was vulnerable in a controlled space. The power of lament also connects to a wider Egyptian pattern. Ritual speech was not ornament added to a ceremony. It was part of the ceremony itself. A spell could identify a body, ward off harm, preserve a name, or restore integrity. Egyptian mortuary texts repeatedly show that words were believed to matter because they were effective when spoken correctly. The Osiris myth gives that belief a narrative form. The god is broken, hidden, and mourned, but he is also addressed. The address is itself a form of care. There is also a social dimension to this. In Egyptian temples and funerals, lamentation was not simply private feeling expressed in public. It was a role that could be performed and recognized. Professional mourners are known from historical practice, and later ritual traditions seem to preserve a memory of that wider culture of controlled lament. The myth of Isis and Nephthys gives divine authority to what human mourners did at the tomb. Their cries, gestures, and formulas echo the idea that grief should be voiced in a way that supports the dead, rather than merely expressing the living person's loss. This is why the story moves so naturally from searching to mourning and then toward embalming. Once the scattered god has been gathered enough to be honored, the next task is preservation. Anubis enters this story when mourning has to become a practical act. In Egyptian religion, he is the god most closely linked to embalming, wrapping, and the protection of the dead. He is not a minor helper at the edge of the scene. He is the divine figure who turns care for a corpse into sacred craft. That role fits Egyptian belief because treatment of the body was never separate from treatment of the person. To preserve the dead was to preserve identity, name, and the chance of continued existence. The evidence for Anubis comes through funerary texts and temple traditions rather than a single early account. In the oldest royal mortuary inscriptions, especially the pyramid texts, he appears as a powerful funerary god tied to the dead king and to safe passage into the next world. Later traditions make his role more specific. He becomes the one who oversees mummification, guards the bandaged body, and protects the dead from decay and attack. By then, the Osiris myth has given Anubis a central place in the larger logic of Egyptian death rites. If Osiris is the dead ruler who must be restored as far as possible, Anubis is the divine force that makes restoration possible through ritual action. That development matches Egyptian mortuary practice itself. Embalming was not a single act, but a sequence of procedures that required time, skill, and religious authority. The body was washed and dried, treated with substances that slowed decay, wrapped in linen, and placed under protection while prayers and spells were spoken over it. The exact methods changed over time and by status, but the purpose remained stable. The dead were meant to remain recognizable and intact enough to receive offerings and retain their place in the ritual world. In that setting, Anubis does not stand for a decorative mythic idea. He gives divine meaning to a careful human process. Embalming was never only a matter of preserving flesh. It was a religious procedure shaped by the belief that the dead needed to remain intact enough to receive offerings, keep their name, and participate in the afterlife. The body was washed, treated, wrapped, and guarded because physical wholeness had symbolic weight. Egyptian mortuary practice grew around that assumption. The rites did not claim that the corpse would return to ordinary life. They aimed to stabilize the dead person in a transformed condition. Anubis belongs at the center of that process because he stands for protection at the threshold between disappearance and continuation. That threshold mattered in practical terms as well as symbolic ones. Egypt's dry climate could preserve bodies in some early burials, but natural preservation was not reliable enough to satisfy religious expectations. Over time, deliberate embalming became more elaborate, especially among elites, because the dead were increasingly imagined as needing a protected body for the journey beyond death. The rise of mummification was therefore not just a technical advance. It was a response to theological needs. If the dead were to live on in any meaningful sense, then decay had to be restrained. Anubis becomes the god who embodies that restraint. Later Egyptian imagination often placed him directly over the embalming table. That image is familiar, but it should be understood as a developed religious symbol rather than a record of a single event. The mythic Anubis becomes the model for priests who carried out embalming, especially in rituals where the wrapped body was treated as the earthly counterpart of Osiris. In that setting, the priestly role and the divine role reinforced one another. Human embalmers did the work, but the work was understood through divine precedent. Anubis did not replace the mortuary artisan, he sanctified the craft. The association between Anubis and jackals also helps explain why he was such a fitting guardian of the dead. Jackals and related wild canids were known around cemeteries and burial grounds, which made them natural symbols of both danger and protection. A creature that might disturb graves could also be imagined as one that watches over them. Egyptian religion often worked through that kind of reversal. The god in animal form was not a simple copy of the animal in nature, but a controlled and ritualized version of its qualities. In Anubis, the predatory creature of the cemetery becomes a protector of what lies beneath it. There is also an important connection between Anubis and protection. In Egyptian belief, the dead were vulnerable not only to physical decay but to disorder more broadly. Names could be forgotten, boundaries could be lost, the body could be disturbed. The afterlife texts repeatedly try to prevent those dangers through spells, amulets, wrapping, and correct ritual order. Anubis is the god who guarantees that the dead are not left exposed. This protective function helps explain why he remains important, even when Osiris becomes the greater ruler of the dead. Osiris governs the destination, but Anubis helps secure the passage. That relationship is especially clear in the way Egyptian religion distinguishes roles. Osiris is the dead king who has passed into divine authority. Anubis is the guardian of the dead body and the one who attends the funeral's necessary work. The two are not competitors. They belong to different stages of the same religious logic. Osiris represents survival after loss. Anubis represents the careful handling that makes survival possible. One is the destination, the other is the means by which the dead are kept fit for the journey. This division of labor also reflects a broader pattern in Egyptian thought, where sacred order had to be restored step by step. The dead were not simply declared secure, they had to be prepared, named, wrapped, protected, and presented. Each of those actions answered a different danger. Washing removed pollution. Wrapping defined the body's new condition. Spells defended against hostile forces. Offerings maintained the dead person's relationship to the living world. Anubis fits this sequence because he is the god who keeps the sequence itself from breaking down. He is not only associated with the result, he is associated with process. Some later traditions even present Anubis as the inventor or model of embalming itself. That should be treated cautiously, because Egyptian myth often gives sacred techniques to gods in order to explain why the ritual matters. The point is not a literal historical origin. The point is authority. If Anubis embalmed Osiris, then embalming is not an arbitrary human custom. It is a divine practice rooted in the first and most important death in the mythic past. That makes every later burial a small participation in the same sacred pattern. This is also where Osiris changes. Once his body is prepared, he is no longer only the victim of murder or the object of grief. He becomes a figure who can be ritually maintained. In the Osiris myth, embalming is more than a practical response to death. It becomes a sign that the dead body can be kept intact against time, and that preservation itself has sacred meaning. Later Egyptian tradition would treat Osiris as the model of that preserved body, the one whose treatment set the pattern for every other burial. That idea did not emerge from a single early text in a neat form. It developed across funerary practice, temple theology, and later retellings that gave cosmic importance to what embalmers did on earth. This is why the story of Osiris matters so much to Egyptian mortuary religion. A corpse that is cared for, wrapped, protected, and named is no longer simply an abandoned remnant. It is being prepared for a different state of existence. Egyptian burial practice already had deep roots before the Osiris myth became dominant, but the myth gave those practices a divine precedent. The ritual did not need the myth to exist, but the myth gave the ritual an explanation that made it authoritative. If Osiris himself underwent sacred preservation, then the treatment of the dead was not just custom or hygiene, it was participation in a pattern that belonged to the gods. This connection also helps explain why Osiris could become so central in funerary texts from the New Kingdom and later periods. The dead person was often identified with him in spells, hymns, and burial formulas. That identification did not erase the difference between a human being and a deity. It worked by analogy. The deceased entered the same general destiny as Osiris: death, preservation, judgment, and a transformed form of life. The myth gave a structure to that hope. It said that bodily ruin was not the only possible outcome after death, because the first great dead king had already passed through preservation and emerged as a ruler of the underworld. The sources also show that this pattern was understood in different ways. In some traditions, Anubis is closely connected to the embalming of Osiris, and by extension to the work of embalmers and funerary priests. In later religious texts, he appears as a guardian of the dead and the one who oversees the proper handling of the body. That does not mean Egyptians believed a single historical embalming event had literally introduced the craft. Rather, they explained the authority of the ritual by placing it within myth. The first completed burial was not an ordinary burial at all. It was the burial of Osiris, and because of that, embalming gained a divine origin. Later Egyptian ritual language preserves that logic by treating funeral care as something sanctioned by the gods, not invented by craftsmen alone. There is also an important distinction here between preservation and restoration. Osiris is not simply brought back to ordinary life in the way a living king would return to his throne. The myth in most surviving forms does not undo death. Instead, it redefines what comes after it. Osiris becomes the dead one who is whole enough to receive rights, titles, and offerings. That is why the embalmed body matters so much. It is not a temporary delay before the story resumes as before. It is a transformed condition with its own dignity and power. The wrapped body remains dead, but it is no longer subject to neglect, decay without limit, or complete erasure from memory and ritual. Over time, Osiris becomes the clearest symbol of this transformed condition. He is no longer only the murdered king, and not yet simply a ruler in the underworld. He is the preserved dead, the body held together by ritual action. That distinction matters in Egyptian thought. Preservation is not the same as restored life in the ordinary sense, and it is not the same as disappearance. It is something in between, a state in which bodily integrity still counts. The wrappings, oils, prayers, and guarding presence of Anubis all point to that middle condition. The dead are not erased, they are maintained. Egyptian mortuary culture repeatedly returns to that idea in different forms, from elite tomb equipment to temple liturgies, because maintaining the body meant maintaining identity, status, and the possibility of continued existence. This is also the stage at which Osiris begins to function as a model, rather than only a person in the story. A model is something others can follow. If his body can be protected after death, then the human dead can hope for a comparable fate. Egyptian funerary culture does not promise that everyone will become a god in the same way Osiris did, but it does repeatedly present his preserved body as the example to imitate. The wrapped corpse becomes a sign of continuity. It says that death has occurred, but it also says that death does not have the final word. In tombs and mortuary texts, that idea can be expressed through care for the limbs. the use of protective formulas, and the desire to keep the name and form of the deceased accessible to ritual memory. Later texts make this connection increasingly explicit. The rituals around mummification, the language of protection, and the careful attention to the body all reinforce the same idea: the deceased should be made as secure as possible for the journey ahead. In that sense, Osiris becomes the first mummy not because the Egyptians imagined a single invented technique beginning with him in a literal historical sense, but because his myth supplied the deepest justification for why the body must be preserved at all. From this point forward, the story of Osiris is no longer only about loss and mourning. With Osiris prepared in death, the myth turns to succession. In Egyptian tradition, death does not end the royal line so much as interrupt it, and that interruption has to be repaired. Isis becomes the figure who makes that repair possible. She is not only the mourner at Osiris's side, in later tradition, and in the major mythic cycles that survive from temple and funerary texts, she is also a skilled magician who knows how to work within the hidden rules of life, death, and divine transformation. The conception of Horus is one of the clearest places where the story changes shape from source to source. In some tellings, especially in later literary and temple traditions, Isis creates the conditions for conception after Osiris's death by using magic to unite with him in a changed form. In others, the emphasis falls less on bodily detail and more on the fact that the child is born only after death has already taken place. Horus is a son of mourning as much as of marriage. The important point is not a single fixed method. It is that Isis does not abandon the royal line when Osiris is gone. She acts to continue it. That matters because Horus is not just any child in Egyptian myth, he is the heir. He represents the future of legitimate kingship, and in many traditions he stands in direct relation to the throne that Osiris has lost. Osiris belongs to death and the hidden realm. Horus belongs to the world that must still be ruled. The story therefore creates a bridge between them. Osiris becomes the dead king, and Horus becomes the living successor who can restore what was broken. Some versions place the conception while Osiris is still whole before the violence carried out by Set. Other traditions make the conception part of the aftermath, when Isis gathers what remains of her husband and uses magical power to bring forth a child from loss. Egyptian sources do not always present this as a contradiction. Myths could preserve more than one theological purpose at once. One version highlights fertility and continuity. Another makes the birth of Horus the direct answer to death itself. Both support the same larger idea. The line of kingship cannot be destroyed because it renews itself through divine means. The magic attached to Isis is important in its own right. She is one of the great figures of Egyptian religion because she combines grief, knowledge, and effective speech. Her power is not shown as spectacle, it is shown as competence. She knows how to preserve, how to invoke, and how to bring hidden things into being. In the Osiris cycle, that skill is what turns loss into future life. Horus is not born from ordinary human survival. He is the product of ritual knowledge, sacred intent, and divine continuity. Later funerary and temple traditions often connect this conception with the broader pattern of Egyptian renewal. Just as grain returns after burial in the earth, so the kingship returns through the child of the dead god. That comparison is not always stated in the same way in every source, but it reflects the symbolic logic that made the Osiris story durable. What is hidden can emerge again. What is buried can still produce life. Horus embodies that possibility in a person. There is also a political side to the myth. Egyptian kingship was repeatedly explained through divine descent, and the Horus child gave that idea narrative form. The reigning king could be understood as Horus, while Osiris became the dead predecessor who had passed into the next world. This did not erase the human reality of succession, but it wrapped that reality in sacred language. The new ruler was not simply replacing the old one, he was continuing a cosmic pattern that had already been established by the gods. That is why this stage of the myth feels so important after Osiris's burial and preservation. The story could have remained a tale of mourning. Instead, it becomes a tale of continuation. The dead king is secured, the widow has acted, and the next generation begins to take shape before the struggle with Set is even finished. Horus is still distant here, still not yet the victorious avenger of later episodes, but his existence changes the direction of the story. The future of kingship has entered the myth, and from here the narrative can move toward concealment, protection, and the long wait for the child who will one day claim what was taken. In some of the best-known later accounts, this conception is tied to the period when Isis has gone into hiding after Set's violence, seeking safety for what remains of Osiris's line. That detail matters because it links the child's origin to danger from the start. Horus is not simply a promised heir in the abstract. He is a child whose existence must be protected before he can be recognized. Egyptian myth often treats this as a necessary stage in the restoration of order. The heir is born in secrecy because the world that produced him is still hostile to his claim. The sources also preserve a strong sense that the child's birth was unusual, even by divine standards. Some texts and later summaries speak as if Horus emerges from a deliberate act of divine making, while others leave the process more veiled. A number of temple traditions dwell on Isis's role as one who knows names, formulas, and rites that ordinary beings do not possess. That emphasis is consistent with her wider place in Egyptian religion. She is not merely a wife waiting for rescue, she is an active guardian who can use knowledge to overcome the limitations imposed by death. In that sense, the conception of Horus belongs with a larger set of Egyptian ideas about sacred speech and efficacy. To know the right words was to do real work in the world. The child who results from this hidden union also carries a larger generational meaning. Osiris's kingship has moved beyond the visible world, but it has not disappeared. It has passed into a transformed state, and Horus becomes the form in which that authority can return. This is one reason the myth was so useful in royal ideology. It allowed Egyptian culture to say that rule was not interrupted by death in any final sense. Instead, death created the condition for renewal. The father becomes the dead king, the son becomes the active one, and the mother binds the two together through ritual power and legitimacy. At the same time, the story does not present this renewal as easy. The conception of Horus is only the beginning of a longer and more fragile process. A child can be born, but he must still survive long enough to inherit. He must still be hidden, raised, and defended against the rival who has already taken control. That is why this episode carries so much narrative weight. It marks the point where grief turns into strategy. Isis no longer only mourns Osiris, she acts with purpose toward the future. For Egyptian audiences, that future was never entirely abstract. Once Horus enters the story, the Osiris cycle becomes less about loss and repair alone, and more about inheritance. In later Egyptian tradition, Horus is the son whose right to rule should already belong to him by descent and by the larger pattern of kingship. But that future is not secure at birth. The child is vulnerable, and that vulnerability gives this part of the myth its shape, hiding, protection, and delayed fulfillment instead of immediate revenge. Egyptian sources do not preserve a single fixed version of Horus's childhood. The details vary from text to text. Some traditions place Isis with the child in the marshes of the Nile Delta, and later Greek writers associate this with Chemis. Other versions are less concerned with geography than with the fact of concealment itself. The basic idea stays the same. The heir must survive before he can act. Egypt's future king is not raised in public. He is kept beyond Set's reach until the right moment. That hidden childhood also shows why Horus is not simply another form of Osiris. Osiris becomes the dead father, preserved and transformed. Horus becomes the living claim that follows him. The two are linked, but they are not interchangeable. In Egyptian thought, a dead king could be identified with Osiris, while a reigning king could be identified with Horus. That pattern gave kingship a continuity that outlasted any one ruler. Horus is therefore not only a child in the myth, he is succession itself, still threatened, but already carrying legitimacy. Later retellings often sharpen the danger around him. In some traditions, Set searches for the child and tries to destroy him before he matures. That detail fits the larger conflict, even when the surviving sources do not all tell it the same way. A threatened child answers a political problem that kingdoms always face: how lawful rule survives interruption. Egyptian mythology answers by saying that the heir is not lost, only hidden. The delay is painful, but temporary. Order has not ended. It has gone underground. The goddess who makes that survival possible is Isis. Her role in hiding Horus is as important as her search for Osiris. She is not only a mourner or a magical helper, she is also a protector of succession. In later literature, she becomes the model mother, one who shields a divine child from hostile power and understands that knowledge, speech, and concealment can all serve as defense. Egyptian myth does not sharply separate family care from sacred function. To guard Horus is to guard the future of kingship. In some texts and later religious traditions, her protection also shows practical intelligence. She uses spells, caution, and hidden places rather than direct force. That suits a story in which the vulnerable heir must outlast a stronger enemy. Safety is not simple here. It is something achieved. There is also a wider religious background behind the story. Divine children were not unique to Horus, but Horus became the one most closely tied to the monarchy. Some local cults had already emphasized a more mature Horus as a sky god or falcon deity before the Osiris cycle was fully systematized. The child form becomes clearer as Osiris takes center stage in funerary thought. That is one reason the myth feels layered. It is not a single invention from one period. It grew as older regional gods were drawn into a larger story about death, succession, and restoration. In that process, Horus gathers several identities at once: avenger, heir, child, and future ruler. Egyptian religion often allowed gods to hold more than one role without resolving the tension between them. Here, that flexibility matters. The same god can be a young victim in one context and a cosmic king in another. In that larger story, concealment is not a pause with no meaning, it is preparation. Horus grows in secret while Set still holds power. The imbalance is real, and the texts do not rush to erase it. Egyptian tradition allows the wrong ruler to remain for a time. That, too, is part of the myth's logic. Justice may be delayed, but it is not abandoned. The heir survives because those who preserve him understand what he represents. He is not merely a son waiting to grow up. He is the return of rightful order in a form that can endure. His hidden childhood makes later restoration feel earned. The future does not arrive by magic alone. It is protected, carried, and brought to maturity under pressure. That emphasis on secrecy fits a culture that valued the controlled transmission of power. Kingship in Egypt was never treated as an ordinary family matter, even when it was described in family terms. The royal child belongs to the house, the gods, and the state at once. If that child is threatened, the danger reaches beyond one household. It becomes political. The myth answers by placing the child beyond immediate reach. The marshes, the hiding place, and the care of Isis all create a boundary between fragile life and hostile force. They also make room for time. A legitimate heir cannot always be installed at once. Sometimes he must be preserved until he is able to claim what is already his. This is one reason the Horus cycle later became so important in royal ideology. It offered a model in which succession was not merely ceremonial but cosmic. The child who is hidden is still king in principle, even if he is not yet acting as king in fact. That difference between principle and action is central to the myth. Set may occupy the visible world, but he does not erase the rightful line. The royal future exists in concealment until it can return. For an audience living with dynasties, disruptions, and shifts in authority, that idea had clear force. It let the myth speak about continuity without denying crisis. So this stage of the story narrows in on survival. Osiris has been secured in death, Isis has protected what remains, and now the future lives in hiding. By the time Egyptian funerary tradition reaches its mature form, Osiris is no longer only the slain ruler at the center of a family tragedy. He has become something larger and more stable than the events that destroyed him. In the texts, he is placed in the hidden realm of the dead, the Duat, where he receives the authority that the living world took away. That shift matters. The myth is no longer only about loss, but about what survives after loss. Osiris is still dead, yet he is also present in a new and permanent role, one that explains why death in Egyptian religion is not simply an ending. The clearest early evidence for this comes from royal funerary texts, especially the pyramid texts, where Osiris appears as a powerful dead king and as a model for the deceased ruler's fate. Later traditions build on that foundation. In those sources, the dead king does not merely vanish, he follows Osiris into a transformed state. Osiris becomes the one who has crossed over first, and because he has crossed over first, he can stand as a precedent for others. Egyptian religion often works this way. A divine event in myth becomes a pattern for human death. Osiris is the pattern that gives death structure. This is why he is so often described as ruler of the dead, though that title should be understood carefully. Egyptian texts do not always present him in exactly the same way, and the underworld is not a single fixed place in the modern sense. But the broad idea is consistent. Osiris belongs to the Duat, the realm through which the dead must pass, and he is associated with the blessed dead who endure there. He is not a distant creator god looking down from outside the system. He is a dead king who has become part of the system itself. That makes him especially important for mortuary belief, because he shows that the dead can have status, authority, and continuity. In some funerary literature, Osiris also takes on a judge-like quality. This does not mean that every source describes him as the sole judge of the dead in the same formal way. The tradition is more layered than that. But he is repeatedly linked with the idea that the dead are not all treated alike. Their moral condition matters. Their relation to truth, order, and ritual correctness matters. In this setting, Osiris is tied to the standard by which the dead are assessed, even when other deities and forces are involved in the process. The deceased seeks not just survival, but justified survival. To enter Osiris's domain is to enter a realm where being dead is not enough. The dead must also be fit to remain. This fits the larger Egyptian understanding of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and ordered life, Osiris is not simply a symbol of resurrection in the abstract. He is bound to the same order that made kingship meaningful in life. The dead king who becomes Osiris has not escaped rule. He has entered a different form of rule. That is one reason his story endured so widely. It connected the fate of a person after death with the same ideals that governed the throne, the temple, and proper conduct in society. In Egyptian thought, the afterlife was not a separate moral universe. It was an extension of the same order that structured the visible world, and Osiris helped make that continuity intelligible. The setting for this continuity is important. The Duat is not described as a simple shadowland. In surviving texts, it is a dangerous, changing realm marked by gates, guardians, transformations, and tests. The dead do not just arrive there and remain unchanged. They must move through it with the aid of names, spells, offerings, and correct ritual knowledge. Osiris occupies this world as its central figure, but he is also part of a larger network of divine and magical protection. His importance comes partly from the fact that he anchors that network. He gives the underworld a focal point, so that the journey of the dead is not random wandering, but a passage toward recognized belonging. In some versions, this underworld role also places Osiris in relation to judgment scenes that became especially prominent in later funerary tradition. The best-known example is the weighing of the heart in the Book of the Dead, where the dead are assessed in the presence of deities linked to truth and justice. Osiris is not always the only authority in these scenes, and the details vary by period and text. Still, he stands near the center of the process as the figure who embodies accepted deadness and rightful continuation. The deceased hopes to be accepted before him or into his company, because that acceptance signals that the journey has succeeded. This is not a crude punishment system. It is a religious way of saying that life has consequences, ritual matters, and the dead must be made fit for the realm they seek to enter. In later funerary compositions, especially the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead, the reach of Osiris grows beyond kings alone. This is an important shift in Egyptian religion. In the earliest royal inscriptions, the hope of joining Osiris is concentrated around the pharaoh. Over time, the language of the afterlife becomes more available to officials and, eventually, to a broader range of people who could afford the necessary rites and texts. Osiris remains central, but he is no longer only the dead king's god. He becomes the model for many dead Egyptians who wanted to pass safely into the next world. His story, once tied closely to royal succession, becomes a more personal map of survival. The texts themselves reflect this widening audience. Coffin inscriptions, funerary spells, and related compositions show that ideas once reserved for court and temple were being adapted for non-royal burials, even if access still depended on status and resources. That wider reach did not erase the older royal meaning. It built on it. Osiris still carried the memory of sovereignty. He was still the one who had been wronged, restored, and set apart, but now that pattern could be applied to anyone hoping for endurance beyond the grave. The dead person did not become Osiris in a literal sense, yet the deceased could be identified with him in ritual language. The point was to share in his condition, protected, justified, and able to continue. The myth therefore moves from one dead king to a larger promise about all properly prepared dead. This is one reason the name of Osiris became so durable in Egyptian religious language. It could hold both the dignity of kingship and the vulnerability of ordinary death. Egyptian mortuary practice also gave this idea material form. Tomb equipment, offering formulas, amulets, inscriptions, and ritual recitations all work together to place the dead within an Osirian framework. A coffin was not just a container. It could be treated as a protective substitute body. The written spells on it were not decoration. They were part of the deceased person's preparation for passage. When these objects invoke Osiris, they are not merely naming a god. They are placing the dead into a known religious order in which transformation is possible. That is why the god's underworld role cannot be separated from the physical culture of burial. The texts and the objects belong to the same system. By the later periods, this Osirian afterlife was reinforced by temple ritual and mortuary practice. The god was honored in festivals, and his story was woven into annual acts of remembrance and renewal. That ritual life helped fix his role in the underworld imagination. He was not only the subject of a story told after the fact. Once Osiris became the dead king with whom the deceased could be identified, Egyptian funerary religion had to answer a harder question: how was a person judged worthy to join him? That answer developed gradually. It did not begin with a single fixed courtroom scene preserved unchanged from the earliest period. Over centuries, the idea became clearer in funerary texts and temple traditions. What stayed constant was the principle behind it. The dead had to be aligned with Ma'at, the Egyptian idea of truth, order, justice, and proper balance. In life, Ma'at described the right arrangement of the world. In death, it became the measure of whether a person could continue. The most familiar form of that judgment appears in the New Kingdom, especially in the Book of the Dead, where the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. That image is later than the oldest Osirian material, but it did not come from nowhere. Earlier texts already praised the dead for living rightly, speaking truthfully, and avoiding wrongdoing. By the time the judgment scene is fully developed, those older ideas have been gathered into a single ritual vision. The heart matters because it was understood as the seat of memory, character, and intention. If it was heavy with falsehood or disorder, the dead could not pass into blessed existence. If it matched Ma'at, the person was justified. This is where Osiris becomes more than a mythic victim and more than a ruler of the dead. He also becomes the standard of acceptable death. The deceased is imagined before his court, not because every Egyptian text describes the scene in the same way, but because many funerary compositions converge on the same destination. The dead seek to be true of voice, often translated as justified or vindicated. That language matters. It shows that the goal is not only survival, it is legitimacy. The person must be recognized as belonging among the honored dead. The classic weighing scene usually includes Anubis, who oversees the balance, and Thoth, who records the result. These roles are clearest in later written and illustrated versions, rather than in the oldest royal texts. Their presence gives the judgment a careful, procedural character. It is not a chaotic punishment scene, it is an ordered evaluation. Anubis ensures the scale is set correctly. Thoth keeps the record. Osiris receives the result as ruler of the dead, while other divine figures may stand nearby as witnesses or protectors. The composition reflects a broader Egyptian belief that order must be maintained even after death. The threat in the scene is not only failure in a moral sense, it is also distortion. A person who had acted against Ma'at had placed himself outside the proper pattern of the world. Egyptian texts sometimes express this directly through a negative confession, in which the deceased denies a list of offenses before the gods. That is one reason scholars are careful about using the word judgment too narrowly. It was not a single legal procedure copied from a modern court. It was a religious evaluation built from several traditions: confession, purification, weighing, recording, and final acceptance. Different texts emphasize different parts of that process. Some linger on the confession, while others focus on the scale itself, because balance was so central to Egyptian thought. This helps explain why the judgment scene belongs so naturally to Osiris. He had already become the one who suffered, was restored in part, and then ruled in the hidden realm. That made him suitable as the divine figure before whom the dead could appear. He was not the only god of the dead in Egypt, and he did not erase older mortuary powers. But his story provided a framework that could hold them together. The deceased, like Osiris, had to pass through loss and reordering before transformed existence was possible. The weighing of the heart gives that passage a moral form. Renewal is not arbitrary. It has conditions. It depends on whether the person's life remained aligned with the order Osiris now embodies. In older royal funerary texts, the emphasis is sometimes less on a single judgment scene and more on the king's union with the gods, ascent to the sky, or absorption into divine company. The Osiris element is still present, but not yet fully expanded into the later popular image of the Underworld tribunal. By the time of the coffin texts and then the Book of the Dead, these ideas are more accessible to non-royal people. The judgment of the dead becomes one of the most widely recognized parts of Egyptian afterlife belief. It is no longer reserved for a king climbing among the stars. It belongs to anyone whose burial, prayers, and moral life could align them with divine order. Historically, that widening matters. It shows that mortuary privilege did not stay fixed at the top of society. As funerary literature spread, ideas that once belonged mainly to royal settings were adapted for officials, scribes, and other elites, and eventually became part of a broader religious vocabulary. The scene also reflects the way Egyptians thought about speech. To be true of voice was not only to avoid lying in a narrow ethical sense. It meant that one's words could stand in harmony with reality. Egyptian religion placed great importance on correct utterance, whether in prayer, offering formula, spell, or declaration before the gods. Speech could shape what happened, but it also exposed the speaker. A person who had spoken falsely or used words against order had already weakened the self that would be brought before the judges. In that sense, the judgment of the dead linked private behavior, public language, and cosmic balance into one continuum. That is the deeper significance of the weighing of the heart. It makes the afterlife a place of accountability. It says that death does not dissolve meaning, but clarifies it. What a person has done, spoken, and preserved in life still matters. The dead are not merely hidden away. The earliest surviving royal funerary texts do not present the Osiris story as one complete narrative. They preserve it in fragments, spells, epithets, and short allusions scattered through the pyramid chambers of Old Kingdom kings. These inscriptions, now called the pyramid texts, were carved beginning in the late 3rd millennium BCE during the late 5th and 6th dynasties. They are the oldest substantial written source for Egyptian ideas about the king's afterlife. They are not a story in the modern sense. They are ritual language meant to protect the ruler, lift him upward, transform him, and join him to the divine. Even so, Osiris is already there. What appears in these texts is a world in which the dead king is linked to Osiris as a model of survival. Osiris is sometimes the ruler of the dead, sometimes the pattern of the blessed dead, and sometimes the form the king must take in order to continue. The same text can describe the king as a star, as a companion of the sun god, and as one who belongs with Osiris in the hidden land of the dead. Egyptian religion did not insist on one exclusive image of the afterlife. It allowed several to stand together. That flexibility is one reason the Osiris tradition lasted so long, because it could fit older royal beliefs without erasing them. The pyramid texts also show that Osiris was already more than a local god of fertility or kingship. By the time these inscriptions were composed, he had become part of the language used to define a successful death. The dead king is not imagined as simply gone. He is expected to rise, ascend, join the imperishable stars, sit with the gods, or enter the realm where Osiris rules. Some utterances invoke Osiris directly as a lord who can receive the dead. Others imply that the king's body must be restored before he can continue in divine form. The central idea is that death does not end royal identity. It recasts that identity through Osiris so it can endure. The structure of these texts helps explain why Osiris became so central later. They assume that the dead need help. They need words spoken correctly, names preserved, obstacles crossed, enemies repelled, and the body symbolically reassembled. That is close to the logic of the later Osiris myth, in which a broken body is recovered, ritually cared for, and transformed into lasting divine presence. The pyramid texts do not always tell that myth in full. Instead, they preserve pieces of its theology. Osiris is the dead god whose condition the king shares. He is also the one who shows that death can be crossed without losing one's place in cosmic order. In that sense, these texts are less a retelling of a myth than a working liturgy built around it. Because these are royal texts, they reflect the concerns of kingship first. The dead king is not just any person seeking comfort. He is Egypt's ruler, and his survival matters to the stability of the world. In that setting, Osiris becomes a bridge between kingship and the afterlife. The pharaoh does not only inherit a throne on earth. In ritual terms, he also takes on the condition of Osiris in death. That helps explain why later Egyptian funerary literature could extend Osiris's power beyond royalty. If the king could become like Osiris, then others could hope to do so as well, provided they had access to the proper rites, names, and formulas. The royal tombs were the first place where this logic was written in stone, but it did not remain there. The pyramid texts also preserve an important tension in Egyptian thought about the afterlife. Osiris belongs to the underworld, but the dead king also seeks ascent. One tradition reaches downward into the hidden realm, another reaches upward toward the sky. Egyptian religion did not treat this as a contradiction that had to be solved. It allowed a layered afterlife in which the dead might be joined to Osiris and still rise among the stars. The texts keep both possibilities alive. In some spells, the king is identified with the circumpolar stars, which never set and therefore became a symbol of permanence. In others, he travels with the sun god. In still others, he enters the domain of Osiris, where renewal comes through divine association rather than celestial motion alone. This layering also reflects the stage of Egyptian religion when the pyramid texts were composed. The afterlife was not yet presented as a fully standardized doctrine. Different funerary traditions had grown out of different cult centers, and the royal court gathered them together. Some formulas are probably older than others. Some seem to preserve local ritual language. Some may have been adapted from temple practice or from oral traditions that are no longer recoverable. Because the texts were written for the king, they often assume specialized knowledge. They speak in compressed, formal phrases that would have had meaning inside a ritual system, even when that meaning is not obvious now. Modern translation can identify themes, but not always restore every original setting with certainty. Later funerary writings would make these ideas more explicit and more widely available. But the foundation is already visible here. In the pyramid texts, Osiris is no longer only a figure from mythic memory. He is part of the oldest surviving religious language Egypt used to describe death, continuity, and divine restoration. That is why these inscriptions matter so much. They anchor the Osiris tradition in the earliest monumental record, and they show that the story was never only about a murdered king. It was also a practical theology of what the dead might become. At the same time, the pyramid texts make clear that this theology began at the top of society. The language was reserved for the king because the king was thought to mediate between human order and divine order. His survival was not a private concern. It was tied to Maat, the proper balance and stability of the world. If the ruler could be restored and join the gods, then Egypt itself could continue in order. That is one reason Osiris's place in these texts is so important. He is not only a god of the dead, he is a guarantee that death itself can be folded back into order. This early material also helps explain a later development that would reshape Egyptian religion. Over time, privileges once reserved for kings spread to nobles, priests, and eventually many ordinary people who could obtain funerary equipment and rituals. That process is already foreshadowed in the pyramid texts, even if the texts themselves remain royal. Once Osiris became the clearest divine model for surviving death, the logic of identification could move outward. A dead person did not have to be a king to hope for rebirth in Osiris's realm. The royal inscriptions did not create that wider tradition by themselves, but they gave it its oldest surviving framework. If the pyramid texts preserve the earliest royal form of Osiris belief, the coffin texts show what happened when that belief moved beyond the king. These writings, found on coffins from the First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom, were never a single fixed book. They form a large body of spells, instructions, and divine names copied and adapted by different households and local scribes. That marks a major shift in Egyptian religion. The afterlife is no longer described only for the pharaoh in his tomb. It becomes something a wider circle of people can claim, provided they know the proper words and can identify themselves with Osiris. The change is not only social, it changes Osiris himself. In the oldest royal texts, he is already a dead king and a powerful divine presence. But in the coffin texts, he becomes a model the dead can imitate directly. A deceased person can speak as Osiris, travel as Osiris, and hope to share his fate. The logic is simple. Osiris died, was preserved, was restored in some form, and rules in the hidden realm. So the dead, if properly prepared, may also pass through death into a transformed state, rather than simply fading away. That is one reason the coffin texts matter so much. They begin to open an Osirian afterlife to non-royal Egyptians, even if access still depended on status, burial, and the knowledge preserved by scribes and priests. The coffin texts also show how flexible Egyptian mortuary thought had become. Some spells help the dead avoid dangers in the underworld. Others allow movement through gates, marshes, and forbidden places. Others still transform the dead into divine beings, birds, lights, or companions of the gods. Osiris remains central, but he is now part of a wider set of possibilities. The dead do not all take the same path, and the texts do not force them into one destination. Instead, they preserve a religious world in which survival could mean joining Osiris, rising with the sun, or moving through unseen regions by the power of sacred speech. That flexibility is visible in how the texts were used. Because they were written on coffins, they sat close to the body and became part of the burial itself. A spell placed on the coffin wall was not just reading material. It was an active provision for the dead person's continued existence. In some cases, the writing helped mark the coffin as a protected space, almost like a portable tomb chamber filled with ritual language. The names of deities, the identification of the dead with Osiris, and the repeated formulas for safe passage all worked together. They made the coffin more than a container. It became a ritual surface on which the dead person's future could be spoken into being. The historical setting matters here as well. The First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom were times of political fragmentation and reunification, when royal power was changing and local elites held more influence in some regions than they had under the Old Kingdom pyramid builders. That broader social setting helps explain why Osirian language spread so widely. The god of the dead was no longer confined to the king's exclusive burial ideology. People with enough means to commission coffins and enough access to scribal culture could adopt the same religious vocabulary in their own funerary arrangements. The result was not modern democratization, but it was a real widening of religious possibility. By the time of the Book of the Dead, that expansion is even clearer. The title is modern, not ancient. Egyptians called these compositions by different names, most often referring to them as spells for going forth by day. The collection grew over centuries and was written on papyrus, often placed in burials for people who could afford it. Some copies are lavish, some modest, and some contain only selected spells. What unites them is the idea that the dead person can move safely through the dangers of the duat if equipped with the right knowledge. Once again, Osiris stands at the center of the logic. Many spells identify the deceased with him, or with his parts, or with his authority as ruler of the dead. To become an Osiris is to become one of the justified dead, accepted into a divine order that has passed through death and been renewed. The Book of the Dead makes this available in a more personal way than the pyramid texts ever did. It is no longer only the language of kingship. It can be the language of an individual burial, the hopes of a family, and the ritual care of a specific person. The spells are practical in tone. They give names, protections, and formulas for passing judgment, crossing waters, avoiding serpents, and entering the presence of the gods. That practical quality is one reason the tradition endured for so long. It did not ask the dead simply to believe in Osiris, it gave them words to claim his fate. Some of the best-known spells show how closely theology and procedure were linked. A deceased person might need to state their identity before a divine gatekeeper, or deny destructive acts in a confession-like formula that later audiences have often compared to a declaration of innocence. In Egyptian terms, the point was not abstract moral theory. It was successful passage and justified status. The dead had to be recognized, and recognition depended on names, knowledge, and proper alignment with the gods. Osiris was the figure who made that recognition possible because he had already crossed from death into an ordered and enduring existence. Even so, the older royal tradition never disappears. The pyramid texts, coffin texts, and Book of the Dead overlap, rather than replace one another. Some formulas are ancient in origin and continue in altered form. Others are later additions that reflect changing funerary practice. The result is long continuity with real development inside it. The myths of Osiris were not only told in texts. They were also performed in festivals and temple rites, which turned a divine story into something that could be repeated across the calendar year. The best-known forms of these rites belong to later Egyptian religion, especially once temple culture became highly organized. But they drew on older ideas already visible in funerary tradition. Osiris was not just remembered as a dead king. He was treated as a god whose death, restoration, and continued rule could be reenacted for the land and for the dead. One of the clearest patterns in these rites is agricultural. Osiris was closely linked with grain, fertile soil, and renewal after flooding. In Egyptian thought, planting and growth offered a natural image for what happened to him. Seed is hidden in the earth, seems to vanish, and then returns in new life. That does not mean the myth was reduced to a simple farming allegory. The symbolism was broader. Osiris could stand at the meeting point of burial, vegetation, and kingship. The dead were placed under his protection, and the land itself was imagined as sharing the same rhythm of loss and return. This mattered in a country whose life depended on the Nile flood and the timing of cultivation. When the river rose and the fields later became productive again, Osiris could be understood as the power behind that pattern, not as a poetic ornament, but as a divine order linking nature and death. Temples preserved this idea through annual observances, offerings, and processions. Some rites centered on images of Osiris rather than a living statue, especially in temple traditions that emphasized his hidden or mummified form. In those settings, the god was marked as absent, confined, or restored in carefully ordered ritual action. That absence mattered. It reflected the mythic logic that Osiris had passed beyond ordinary life, yet remained active through divine presence and cult. Later Egyptian sources describe ceremonies in which his body was symbolically sought, mourned, assembled, and renewed. The exact form of these rites changed from place to place, and there was no single uniform ceremony for all of Egypt. The evidence points instead to a family of related observances, shaped by local temple practice and by the theology of each sanctuary. Some forms likely belonged to priestly circles, while others reached wider audiences through public festival movement or offerings brought by visitors. Even where the details differ, the recurring pattern is clear enough to show that ritual was one of the main ways the myth stayed active. A major place in this ritual world belongs to Abydos. By the Middle and New Kingdoms, Abydos had become one of the most important centers of Osiris devotion, and people sought to connect themselves with his burial and hidden power there. Pilgrimage, memorial offerings, and the desire to be associated with Osiris's sacred status gave the site unusual prestige. In later tradition, Abydos was treated not merely as a temple city, but as a place where the god's presence was especially near. That kind of sacred geography is important. It shows how myth and landscape reinforced one another. A story about a murdered and restored god could become attached to a specific place, and that place could then draw prestige from the story. Tomb inscriptions and memorial stelae from later periods show ordinary people as well as elites asking for prayers, offerings, and continued remembrance in connection with Osiris and Abydos. The god's cult there was not separate from mortuary practice. It helped define how the living hoped to secure a place for the dead. Other rites emphasized lamentation. The mourning for Osiris was not private feeling, but formalized, voiced, and shared. Isis and Nephthys appear in ritual contexts as divine mourners who call attention to the loss and appeal for restoration. Their cries were not decorative additions to the myth. They helped define the movement from death toward renewed power. In Egyptian ritual thinking, lament could be effective. To name loss was part of resisting it. To speak over the dead was part of preparing the dead for survival. This is one reason Osirian ritual had such lasting force. It joined grief to action. The two goddesses also gave ritual a family frame. Their mourning made the god's death intelligible, not as an abstract cosmic event, but as an event that demanded witness, care, and continued speech. In funerary settings, that pattern could be extended to human death. A household loss and a divine loss were not identical, but they were close enough that the ritual language of Isis and Nephthys could speak to both. Some festivals also staged a controlled form of conflict between disorder and renewal. Set was not always absent from these observances, because the myth did not simply erase him. His role remained necessary to explain why Osiris had to be protected, assembled, and vindicated. In the ritual year, the defeat of disruption could be repeated without pretending that disruption had never existed. That gave the observances a practical seriousness. They did not promise a world without death or conflict. They promised that these things could be endured, named, and ritually answered. In some local traditions, this may have taken the form of dramatic opposition, while in others it was expressed more quietly through ritual statements, divine titles, or the sequence of offerings. Either way, the point was not to deny fracture, it was to restore order after it had been broken. The annual reenactment of Osiris's death and return is sometimes described in modern summaries as a single festival, but the historical picture is more layered. Egyptian religion included local ceremonies, temple mysteries, and public processions that did not all work the same way. Some rites may have been closely guarded, especially where temple tradition handled sacred images or internal acts of restoration. Others were more public and tied to local devotion or agricultural time. What stays consistent is the logic behind them. Osiris was the god who had been lost, who was sought, who was mourned, and who remained effective after death. Ritual did not merely recall that story, it entered it. By reenacting search, lament, and renewal, priests and worshippers could participate in the divine pattern, rather than only remember it from a distance. That is why these ceremonies mattered beyond the temples. They showed ordinary Egyptians that the Osiris myth was not only a tale about remote divine events, it belonged to burial, to seasonal change, to family mourning, and to the hope that the dead could continue in a transformed state. By the time Egyptian tradition reaches its mature form, the Osiris story is no longer one fixed tale told in one voice. It has become a family of related accounts attached to different cities, temples, and ritual settings. The broad outline stays familiar. Osiris is killed, hidden, found, restored in some limited way, and then established as ruler of the dead. But the details shift depending on where the story is told and what religious purpose it serves. That variety is one reason the myth remained useful for so long. It could be adapted to a local cult, a funerary text, or a royal ideology without losing its core meaning. At Heliopolis, the city closely associated with solar theology and priestly learning, Osiris is often placed within a larger divine order that includes creation, kingship, and succession. The emphasis there tends to fall less on dramatic narrative than on Osiris's place within cosmic and royal legitimacy. He is not isolated as a tragic figure. He belongs to a wider framework in which divine rule passes from one generation to the next, and the dead king is folded into a continuing system of order. That helps explain why Osiris became so important to royal funerary language. He was not only a god who died, he was a god whose death could mean continuity. In the political world of ancient Egypt, that mattered. Kings had to justify succession, and they also had to imagine what happened after death. Osiris could serve both needs because he linked the end of one ruler's life to the ordered survival of kingship itself. Abydos preserved a different emphasis, and in many later sources it became the most important cult center for Osiris himself. There, the god was tied more closely to burial, pilgrimage, and the presence of sacred relics or commemorative sites. Ancient Egyptians came to treat Abydos as a powerful place associated with Osiris's burial and hidden body. even though the exact form of that association varies from text to text. Some traditions make the site central to the recovery or remembrance of Osiris. Others treat it as a place where his cult became especially strong because it offered a tangible landscape for mourning and renewal. In practical terms, Abydos gave the myth a geography. It made the story of loss and restoration feel anchored in Egyptian soil. That local grounding helps explain why people traveled there, why monuments accumulated there, and why the site remained important long after the earliest versions of the myth had already changed. A story about a hidden god becomes more durable when a community can point to a place and say that this is where the memory belongs. A different kind of variation appears in the Byblos-linked traditions. In those accounts, the chest or coffin carrying Osiris drifts beyond Egypt and comes to rest in or near Byblos on the Levantine coast. A version preserved most famously by Plutarch, writing much later in Greek, tells how the coffin becomes trapped in a tree and later discovered there. That is not the oldest surviving Egyptian form, and it should not be treated as an early record. But it does show how the Osiris myth could expand outward, linking Egyptian religion to foreign places and trade routes. Byblos was not just a destination in a story. It also reflected the larger world in which Egypt lived, where materials, cult objects, and religious ideas moved across the eastern Mediterranean. In that kind of retelling, Osiris becomes a god whose loss is so complete that it crosses borders before he is recovered. The foreign setting also gives the story a different emotional shape. Instead of a death that remains inside the Egyptian landscape, the body's journey creates a wider arc of disappearance, recognition, and return. Late temple traditions preserve still another layer. In those sources, especially the priestly compositions of the 1st millennium BCE and later, the Osiris myth often becomes more systematic, more textual, and more closely tied to ritual recitation. The story is no longer only remembered, it is organized, explained, and repeated in forms suited to temple practice. These texts may preserve older elements, but they also reshape them. They can add detail, harmonize contradictions, or give a local theology a fuller narrative frame. That is why the same event may appear in different forms. One source may stress the concealment of the body, another the rescue, another the lament, and another the judgment of the dead. The myth remained stable in meaning even when its narrative clothing changed. In a temple setting, that stability mattered more than strict uniformity. Ritual depended on recognizable themes, not on one fixed literary version. A lament could be effective whether it focused on Isis alone, on the paired mourning of Isis and Nephthys, or on the broader recovery of divine order after violence. Some of the disagreements are not minor. The number of body parts scattered after Set's violence is not the same in every account. The places where they are found differ. The order of events can shift. In some traditions, Osiris is already strongly associated with underworld kingship before the body is reassembled. In others, that transformation feels more gradual. Even the roles of Isis and Nephthys vary in emphasis, depending on whether the text is mainly concerned with mourning, resurrection, royal succession, or funerary protection. These are not signs of confusion so much as signs of a living religious tradition. Egyptian myth was not frozen in a single canonical form. It was repeated, adapted, and localized over centuries. What appears as contradiction from the outside could function as flexibility from within. Different temples needed different emphases, different periods inherited different materials. Later compilers often preserved several strands at once rather than choosing one and discarding the others. What remains consistent is the central pattern. Osiris is the god who is cut off from ordinary life and then made present again in a different mode. He is the one who is mourned, sought, restored, and enthroned in the hidden realm. That pattern could be expressed through royal theology at Heliopolis, pilgrimage and burial memory at Abydos, long-distance legend in the Byblos story, or temple liturgy in later periods. Each version preserved the same basic answer to the same human problem. Death ends visible power, but it does not end meaning memory or divine authority. It also does not end the possibility of legitimate rule. In Egyptian thought, the dead king could remain active as a secure figure of continuity, and Osiris gave that idea a divine form. That is why the differences matter. They do not weaken the story. They show how widely it traveled through Egyptian culture, from temple to tomb, from city to city, and from one age to another. By the time Osiris was fully established in Egyptian religion, he was no longer only a figure in a myth. He had become a way of thinking about death itself. Kingship, burial, moral judgment, and the hope of renewal gathered around his name, and that is one reason his influence lasted so long. In royal ideology, the dead king could be identified with Osiris, while the living successor took on the role of Horus. That pairing turned succession into a sacred pattern. The old ruler did not simply vanish. He passed into the hidden realm, and the next ruler inherited the world of daylight. Osiris helped Egypt imagine continuity where ordinary life seemed to end. This pattern is visible first in royal funerary tradition, but it did not remain limited to kings. The older texts already point in that direction, and later funerary literature makes it much clearer. In the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, the deceased king is sometimes linked with Osiris in language that still reflects royal exclusivity. By the Middle Kingdom, especially in the coffin texts, the same divine pattern is extended more openly to non-royal dead. The dead person can be joined to Osiris, named among the justified and imagined as surviving in a transformed state. That does not mean Egyptian belief was simple or uniform. Different periods used different language, and different communities emphasized different parts of the journey. But the overall direction is clear. Osiris became the standard divine reference point for anyone hoping that death could lead to more than disappearance. His importance also shaped Egyptian burial practice. Mummification was not just a technique for preserving a body. In religious terms, it placed the dead person within an Osirian model. The body was wrapped, protected, and prepared with the expectation that identity should endure. This is why Osiris and embalming stayed so closely linked in later tradition. The myth gave ritual a reason, and ritual gave the myth daily reinforcement. Every burial became a small repetition of the larger story: loss, care, protection, and the hope that what had been broken could still be made whole enough to continue. Even the visual language of the dead could reflect this. Funerary masks, bandaging, and the careful arrangement of the corpse all helped express the idea that the dead person was not simply discarded, but transformed into a protected and enduring state in the manner associated with Osiris. There was also a political dimension to this influence. Egyptian kings did not rule as ordinary men in religious thought. They were bound into the same cosmic order that Osiris represented. The living king maintained Ma'at, the proper order of the world, while the dead king became Osiris, the ruler of the unseen realm. That arrangement helped explain why legitimate rule mattered so much. It was not only a matter of force or inheritance, it was a sacred transfer between two modes of kingship. Osiris stood behind the throne as the dead sovereign whose authority was still present, even though it no longer appeared in public life. Later temple traditions and royal inscriptions continued to work within this framework, even when they used different local emphases. In some periods, especially when royal ideology grew more elaborate, the Osiris-Horus sequence became one of the clearest ways to present continuity between death and accession. The old ruler's disappearance did not mark a collapse of order. It marked a transition that confirmed order had existed in the first place. The story also endured because it could be adapted without losing its core. At Abydos, Osiris was tied strongly to burial memory and pilgrimage, and the site became one of the most important centers of his cult. The importance of Abydos is not accidental. It was linked in tradition to early kingship and to the burial landscape that Egyptians associated with sacred precedent. Pilgrims and officials who visited there could participate in a remembered connection to Osiris through offerings, memorial practices, and symbolic association with the god's resting place. In Heliopolitan theology, he fit into broader ideas about divine order and royal succession. There, Osiris was not isolated from the sun god's world of cosmic explanation, but folded into a larger system in which death, regeneration, and kingship could be interpreted together. In the Byblos tradition, his body travels outside Egypt and returns through a chain of discovery and recovery that links him to wider Mediterranean geography. That version, preserved in later literary sources, shows how far the story could travel while still remaining recognizably Osirian. Later temple texts preserve still more details, but they do not replace the older material so much as rearrange it. The point was never to fix one final version. The point was to keep the pattern meaningful in new settings. What makes Osiris especially durable is that his myth speaks to several human concerns at once. It explains why burial matters. It gives grief a ritual structure. It links kingship to responsibility. It promises that death can be judged rather than merely endured. And it offers a model of survival that does not depend on simple restoration to ordinary life. Osiris does not return unchanged to the world above. He becomes something different, a hidden ruler, a judge-like figure, and a divine center for the dead. In later Egyptian thought, especially in funerary compositions and temple hymns, he can stand for the possibility that the deceased will be assessed, justified, and incorporated into a lasting divine order. That transformation is part of the message. Continuity in Egyptian religion did not always mean a return to the same condition. It often meant passage into a more lasting form. The dead were not merely wished back into the world of the living. They were imagined as entering a structured afterlife in which identity could remain meaningful under new conditions. That is why Osiris remained central across so many centuries of Egyptian thought. In the end, Osiris remains where the myth placed him, At the center of a kingdom death does not erase. He is the fallen ruler, the hidden body, the revived presence, and the God who rules what comes after. That is why his story endured in Egypt. It gave form to mourning without making loss meaningless. It gave justice a place in the afterlife. It offered a way to imagine continuation without requiring the dead to return unchanged. Osiris is not simply restored, he is transformed into the Lord of the Dead, and in that transformation, Egypt found one of its most enduring answers to mortality.